This narrative is called My Parents Begged Me to Come Home for Christmas after they took my college fund to pay for my sister, so I took my revenge, and now they are begging. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel isn't gaining as much attention lately, and subscribing is a simple yet effective way you can support us. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you great content. Your support means the world. Let's keep growing the channel together. Thanks so much. Now, let's dive into the video. Hey everyone, I'm Mel, a 28-year-old woman, and I really need to share this story. It's a bit long, but I have to write it down somewhere. I haven't spoken to my parents or my sister, whom I'll refer to as Jen, in 8 years. I'm not exactly sure how to begin, but here goes. I work at a large investment firm downtown, those tall buildings with posh lobbies where everyone is dressed in suits. I work there. I'm good at my job, have saved enough for my own place, and am married to Dan, 32, a fantastic lawyer. Honestly, life is pretty great now, but it hasn't always been this way. Growing up, everything was about my sister, Jen. She's 3 years older, and my parents acted like she was flawless. Every small thing she did was amazing to them. If she got a C+ in math, they'd praise her for trying hard. If she dropped out of college, they'd say, "College isn't for everyone." At 19, she got married to a guy she met at a gas station. They called it young love. Meanwhile, I was working hard to get straight A's, holding down a part-time job at a dull office supply store, and working to get into a great college. But nothing I did ever seemed to matter. I could have discovered the cure for cancer, and they'd have said, "That's nice, honey, but have you seen Jen's new hair?" The real issue began when I received my college acceptance letter. I had earned a partial scholarship to study finance, which was huge for me. I'd been planning this for a long time. My grandma, Dad's mother, had left me some money specifically for my education. It wasn't a huge amount, but combined with my scholarship and savings, it would have been enough to cover everything. I remember rushing home that day, thinking maybe, just maybe, my parents would finally be proud of me. I found my mom sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone as usual. Dad was in his chair watching TV. "Mom, Dad, I got in." I showed them the letter. My mom barely looked up and said, "That's nice, honey." Then she asked about Grandma's college fund. Dad turned off the TV, which never boded well. He did that thing where he wouldn't look me in the eye. "We had to use that money for something else," he said. I felt like I'd been splashed with cold water. "What do you mean?" I asked. He explained that Jen's wedding was coming up, and we all know how expensive weddings are. I stood there, shocked, as they'd used the money my grandma left for my education to pay for Jen's third wedding. Yes, third. She'd already had 2 failed marriages by 23. I couldn't hold it in anymore. I started shouting about how unfair it was, how they always put Jen ahead of me. My mom defended herself, calling me selfish and saying I should be happy for Jen. Dad just sat there, uncomfortable as always when things got tense. That night, I packed my things and left, taking only what would fit in my car. I drove to Aunt Pat's house, my mom's sister, but they didn't get along because my mom thought Aunt Pat was too outspoken. Aunt Pat took me in without hesitation. I later found out she'd been saving money for her son's college fund, but he had passed away in a car accident a few years before. She offered to help me pay for college, but I agreed on the condition that I would pay her back every penny. College wasn't easy. I worked at a cafe that always smelled like burnt coffee while attending full-time classes. I needed to keep a certain GPA to maintain my scholarship, so I spent almost all my time in the library. But I did it. I graduated with honors, landed a job at the investment firm, and paid back every cent to Aunt Pat within 2 years. It's also where I met Dan. He was handling legal work for the firm, and we kept bumping into each other in the break room. He asked me out for coffee, and the rest is history. We got married last year, bought a house, and things were finally going well. I hadn't spoken to my family at all during this time. No calls, no emails, nothing. Jen had my number but never contacted me. My parents sent a card when I graduated, probably because Aunt Pat told them, but that was it. So, that's the background. I needed to explain all of this so the events that followed make sense. It all started last Christmas. I should have seen it coming because Aunt Pat was acting strange for days. She'd start saying something on the phone, then stop herself. But I was too caught up in work to pay attention. Dan and I had a tradition of spending Christmas Eve at Aunt Pat's. She makes these amazing cinnamon rolls that fill the house with an incredible aroma, and we usually just hang out, watch movies, and open one gift at midnight. It's always so laid back. We arrived at her place around 6 p.m. I was carrying a huge tray of my version of sweet potato casserole. Probably not as good as hers, but I try. Dan was carrying the gifts. The moment I opened the door, I knew something was off. There were too many coats on the rack and too many shoes by the door. Then I heard them. My mom laughing, my dad's voice, and Jen talking loudly. I froze at the door. Dan walked straight into me because I stopped suddenly, and the casserole almost flew out of my hands. 8 years. It had been 8 years since I'd seen any of them, and there they were, sitting in Aunt Pat's living room like they belonged. My mom's hair was mostly gray now. She used to dye it all the time. Dad had gained a lot of weight, and Jen, well, she looked exactly the same, except now she had 2 kids I didn't even know clinging to her legs. Aunt Pat rushed over, looking like she was about to cry. "Mel, I'm so sorry. They showed up just an hour ago. I tried to call, but your phone went straight to voicemail." I had my phone in my bag on silent because of work. Great timing, right? I couldn't move. I literally couldn't make my feet work. Dan placed his hand on my back and whispered, "We can leave if you want." But before I could respond, my mom saw me. "Mel, sweetheart," she said, rushing over like we'd seen each other yesterday. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back so fast I bumped into Dan. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my voice too high-pitched. "It's Christmas," she replied, as if that explained everything. "Family should be together on Christmas," she added. Dad stayed in his chair, awkwardly waving. Jen was busy with her kids, but I could see her glancing at me. The kids, I didn't even know their names. The older boy, around 7, whispered to Jen, probably asking who I was. I made my way to the kitchen, needing to put the casserole down before I dropped it. I needed some air. The kitchen had always been my safe place at Aunt Pat's, where I spent hours doing homework or helping her bake. Dan followed me in. He's always so supportive, knowing when I need backup. "You okay?" he asked. I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. Aunt Pat came in looking miserable. They showed up saying they wanted to make things right. I told them it wasn't a good idea to surprise you like this, but you know your mother. I nodded. I knew my mother, always doing whatever she wanted and dealing with the consequences later. I could hear the kids playing in the living room. Someone had turned on Christmas music, and it felt so wrong, like I'd walked into some alternate reality where the past 8 years hadn't happened. "Should we go?" Dan asked again, already reaching for his car keys. I almost said yes, really. I wanted to say yes, but then I looked at Aunt Pat's face. She had decorated everything beautifully, made all this food, and now she was caught in the middle of this mess. "No," I said. "This is our tradition. I'm not letting them ruin it." Dan nodded, understanding me completely. Aunt Pat squeezed my hand. "Just give me a minute," I said, heading to the back door for some air. It was freezing outside, but the cold felt good. It helped clear my head. I could see through the kitchen window everyone moving around inside, looking like a normal family on Christmas Eve. That's when my mom came out, without a coat for me, of course. "You're going to catch cold," she said, like she had any right to act like my mother after all this time. I had so many questions. Why now? Why like this? Why not call first? But what came out of my mouth was, "Why are you really here?" She started doing that thing where she takes forever to get to the point. "It's about Jen." Of course, it was about Jen. When wasn't it? "Jen's going through some changes," my mom said. I waited. She always talks in circles until someone forces her to get to the point. "Finally," she said, "Jen's getting divorced again." I stared at her. Was that supposed to surprise me? Jen getting divorced was as predictable as the sun rising. And she needs some time to rebuild her life, to find herself. Her tone made me uneasy. "What does that have to do with me?" I asked. That's when Dad came out. Still no coat for me, of course. He looked at me with the same expression he wore when he told me they spent my college fund. "You've done well for yourself, Mel," he said, trying to sound businesslike. "Good job, nice house, stable marriage." I didn't like where this was going. I thought they were here to apologize or express regret. But no. Even after all this time, they still wanted to use me to help Jen. "We were thinking," Mom started. Maybe you could take Ben and Lisa for a while. I thought I'd misheard. Take them? Just until Jen gets back on her feet, Dad added quickly. She needs time to sort things out, find a new place, maybe go back to school. I stood there trying to understand what they were saying. They wanted me, someone they hadn't spoken to in 8 years, to take custody of Jen's kids. Are you serious? I asked. It makes perfect sense, Mom said, like she was suggesting I water her plants while she was on vacation. You've got that big house, and Dan has a good job. You work from home sometimes. I work from home like twice a month, but still, the kids would have stability. And Jen really needs this chance to what? I interrupted. Find husband number 4? Mom's face tightened. That's not fair. Not fair? I laughed, but it wasn't funny. You know what's not fair? Showing up at Christmas after 8 years of silence and asking me to raise someone else's kids. Dad stepped in now, trying to shift the conversation. Mel, No. Where's Jen anyway? Why isn't she asking me herself? Right on cue, Jen appeared in the doorway. She must have been eavesdropping. There you are, she said, like everything was normal. I was wondering where everyone went. She had the kids with her, Ben looking sleepy and Lisa, clutching a worn-out stuffed rabbit, its condition showing clear signs of age. These are your aunt and uncle, Jen said, gesturing toward me and Dan, who had quietly appeared behind me, now holding my coat. Aunt Mel and Uncle Dan. The children simply stared at us, Ben, 7, and Lisa, 5. Jen continued, speaking about them like she was introducing pets. They're really great kids, super independent. Ben can even make his own breakfast. The way she said it, as if that was some sort of selling point, made my stomach churn. A 7-year-old shouldn't be making his own breakfast. Dan was the first to speak. This seems like something that needs more discussion, maybe not on Christmas Eve. Bless him for trying to be diplomatic, but Jen wasn't having it. What's there to discuss? You've got everything. Big house, good jobs, no kids. It's perfect. I just need 6 months, maybe a year, tops. A year? I couldn't believe my ears. Yeah. I've got to get my life together, maybe travel a bit, figure things out. I asked, what about their dad? Jen waved me off dismissively. Oh, he's useless. Probably in Vegas or something. I had to ask, which one? Dad number 1, 2, or 3? My mom gasped. Mel! But Jen just laughed. Number 2. Number 1 moved to Canada, and number 3, well, that marriage got annulled so he doesn't count. I was done. I turned to go inside, but Jen grabbed my arm. Come on, sis, help me out here. I need this. I'm suffocating. I stared at her hand on my arm, then at the kids, and then at my parents, who were watching, probably thinking this was all going according to their plan. One word should have ended this, but instead, it dragged on. After that disastrous Christmas Eve, I thought things would calm down. I figured they'd get the message and leave us alone, but I was wrong. Jen started showing up at our house. At first, it was just random visits with the kids. She'd bring them over, claiming they should get to know their aunt and uncle. I felt bad for Ben and Lisa, so I'd let them in. They're actually sweet kids when Jen isn't around. But then the visits took a strange turn. She started coming alone, always when she knew Dan would be working from home. At first, I didn't think much of it. Dan works from home on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and I'm usually at the office those days. It was our neighbor who first said something. She's an older lady who sees everything that happens on our street. One day, she caught me getting my mail and said, "Your sister sure dresses up when she visits your husband." I was confused. What do you mean? She said, you know, always in those little dresses, even in this cold, and she stays for hours. That's when it clicked. All those times, Jen just happened to show up when Dan was home alone, needing his legal advice about her divorce. I asked Dan about it that night, and he looked unusually uncomfortable, which isn't like him at all. I was going to tell you, he said, but it's been getting inappropriate. Turns out, Jen had been flirting with him for weeks. She'd show up in these skimpy outfits, always finding ways to lean over his desk or touch his arm. Dan tried to keep it professional, both because he's a decent human being and because technically, She was his client for the custody case. But the last straw came when she literally said, and I quote, "You know, if you ever get tired of the boring version, you could always upgrade to the fun sister." The boring version, she meant me. My own sister called me boring while flirting with my husband. Dan shut it down immediately. He told her to find another lawyer and that she wasn't welcome at our house anymore when I wasn't around. I was furious. I called Jen right away. She picked up, sounding cheerful like nothing was wrong. "Hey sis, I was thinking of stopping by tomorrow." "Stay away from my husband," I said. She laughed. Actually laughed. "Oh, come on. We were just having fun. Dan's been so helpful with all this legal stuff." "Jen," I said, "I swear to God you're overreacting. Besides, it's not my fault if Dan finds me attractive. We all know I was always the pretty one." I hung up and called my parents, thinking surely they'd see how messed up this was. Mom's response? "You know how Jen gets when she's stressed. Maybe if you'd agreed to take the kids, she wouldn't be acting out like this." I couldn't even believe I was hearing this. Dan suggested we install security cameras. He thought we might need evidence for what he suspected was coming. He dealt with enough custody cases to recognize the signs. I wanted to believe he was wrong. I wanted to believe Jen would at least pretend to be a decent mother. But Dan was right. The next morning, we woke up to the doorbell ringing continuously. Something felt off. I got up and pulled open the curtains, and there they were. Jen's kids, sitting on our front steps. No jackets, no gloves, just two small suitcases beside them. And Lisa clutching that worn-out stuffed rabbit like it was the only thing keeping her together. I bolted for the door, barely aware that Dan was right behind me. The freezing air hit me like a slap, but it didn't matter. Ben stood up stiffly, rubbing his arms. "Aunt Mel," he said, his voice too quiet, too resigned, like he already knew not to expect much from adults. Dan had already scooped Lisa up, rubbing her cold hands between his. I grabbed Ben's suitcase, and it was too light. When I opened it later, I found just a few shirts, some underwear, and nothing else. Then I saw the note. It was crumpled in Ben's tiny fist. He hesitated before handing it to me, as if already bracing for disappointment. I unfolded it with shaking hands. "There, your problem now. I need to live my life. Jen." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I couldn't process the sheer cruelty of it. She actually left them like they were some inconvenient baggage she could just drop off and forget. I clenched the note so hard it almost ripped. I was shaking with rage, disbelief, and something so raw I couldn't even name it. Dan's voice was tight with barely contained fury. "Get them inside now." I scooped up Ben, even though he was too big to carry, and slammed the door shut behind us. Jen was gone and she wasn't coming back. After that, Dan went into full lawyer mode. He's usually pretty laid back, but I've never seen him so angry. He got the kids inside while I grabbed their suitcases. The bags were barely packed, just a couple of t-shirts and underwear thrown in. Lisa's stuffed rabbit was there, thankfully. She can't sleep without it. We documented everything. Took photos of the note, the suitcases, everything. Thank God for our security cameras. They caught Jen dropping the kids off at 4:30 a.m. and driving away in her beat-up Honda. While I was making the kids breakfast, they were starving. They hadn't eaten since dinner the night before. Dan was making calls. A lot of calls. He contacted CPS first, then the police to file a report, and then his law partner who specializes in family cases. My parents showed up around noon. It turns out Jen had texted them saying, "The kids are with Mel now. All good." As if it was normal to dump your children on someone's doorstep and disappear. Mom started with her usual excuses. "Jen's just overwhelmed. She needs time. She'll come back when she's ready." Dan shut that down fast. "This isn't about Jen anymore. This is child abandonment. It's a crime." Dad tried to argue, saying, "But they're family. We can handle this privately." Dan shot back, "No, we're doing this by the book. Those kids deserve better than being pawns in Jen's games." That's when Mom started crying. "But if you report her, she'll get in trouble." "Yeah," I said. "That's kind of the point." The kids were watching TV in the other room, but I know they could hear everything. Ben kept glancing at us with a worried expression. He was far too familiar with adult problems for a 7-year-old. CPS showed up around 2 p.m. They interviewed all of us. took pictures, checked the house. The social worker was really kind. She talked to Ben and Lisa alone for a bit. When she came out, she looked deeply concerned. It turns out this wasn't the first time Jen had pulled something like this. She'd left the kids with random friends before, sometimes for days at a time. Ben had been taking care of Lisa since he was 6. 6. He makes her breakfast, helps her dress, makes sure she brushes her teeth. No child should have to act as a parent to their sibling. We tried tracking Jen down, called everyone we could think of. Finally, one of her friends cracked and told us Jen had bought a plane ticket to Las Vegas. She was apparently moving in with some guy she met online. She didn't even tell her kids goodbye. Dan filed for emergency temporary custody, saying it was the fastest way to make sure the kids were legally protected while everything was sorted out. CPS agreed. They didn't want to put the kids in the system if there was a stable family willing to take them. My parents keep calling, begging us not to ruin Jen's life. They don't get it. Jen ruined her own life. We're just making sure she can't ruin her kids' lives too. Right now, we're waiting on a court date. The kids are staying with us until then. Dan converted his home office into a temporary bedroom for them. He's been amazing with them, helping Ben with his math homework and reading Lisa 3 bedtime stories until she finally fell asleep. I'm scared, not going to lie. We didn't plan on becoming parents like this, but looking at these kids sleeping on our couch, how could anyone just abandon them? The social worker is coming back tomorrow, and I'll update then. One more update on the Jen situation. She's still in Vegas, posting pictures of herself at pools and casinos like she didn't just abandon her kids. Meanwhile, things with my parents have gotten even messier. CPS called a family meeting yesterday. We all sat down at this big table in Dan's office. The kids were with Aunt Pat. Because what happened next was tough, the social worker began explaining how the system operates, discussing temporary guardianship and other related matters. My parents kept nodding, seemingly following along, until she reached the part about Jen potentially facing criminal charges. That's when Mom lost it and started crying about how everyone makes mistakes and how Jen is still their daughter. Then the social worker dropped the bombshell. Given the circumstances, we need to discuss permanent placement options. Mr. and Mrs., my parents' last name, as the maternal grandparents, you would be the first choice before we consider foster care. You should have seen their faces. Dad started stammering. Oh no, we can't. We're too old. We don't have the space. Mom jumped in quickly. Besides, Mel and Dan have that big house. They're young, they have money. It was like watching history repeat itself. Same excuses, different scenario. It reminded me of the day they told me they'd spent my college fund on Jen's wedding. Dan, bless him, wasn't buying any of it. Actually, he said, pulling out some papers, your house has 4 bedrooms, and you recently took out a home equity loan to renovate your kitchen, so finances aren't the issue. And according to state law, as grandparents, you're legally obligated to be considered first for placement. My dad's face turned red. Now see here, young man. No, you see here. Dan cut in, using his lawyer tone, which always gets people to listen. Your daughter abandoned her children and dumped them on us. She's in Vegas, spending money on hotels while her 7-year-old son is acting as a parent to his 5-year-old sister. This isn't about what's convenient for you. It's about those kids. Mom tried again, but I interrupted. Stop it. All the old feelings from the college fund incident came rushing back. Stop trying to make me fix Jen's messes. You did this her whole life. Cleaned up after her, made excuses, pushed her responsibilities onto me. Not anymore. Then the social worker cleared her throat. If you're unwilling to take custody, we'll need to document your refusal. This will be part of the court record. If no relatives step up, the kids will enter the foster care system. That really got their attention. My parents cared deeply about their image. It's why they spent so much on Jen's wedding. They had to keep up appearances. Mom's face went pale. You mean this would be on record? She asked. Yes, the social worker replied calmly. It will be officially noted that you declined custody of your grandchildren. While it won't be publicly accessible, it will be part of the case file and legal record. Mom's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The next hour was chaos. My parents tried everything. Guilt trips, crying, even offering me money. By the end of the meeting, they had signed temporary custody papers. They're picking up the kids tomorrow. The social worker is doing weekly checks. Dan made sure they couldn't just pass the kids back to Jen if she shows up. Everything has to go through the courts now. I feel weird about it. I know it's the right thing for the kids. They need stability. But watching my parents do the right thing only because they were forced to brings up a lot of old issues. Ben asked me earlier if this meant he didn't have to be in charge of Lisa anymore. God, these kids deserve so much more than this. I don't know how things will go from here, but let's hope for the best. I'll keep you all updated. Final update, a quick update on the ongoing situation with my sister abandoning her kids. See previous posts for background. Okay, Reddit, there's a lot to update you on. Remember how Jen was living it up in Vegas? Yeah, that didn't last long. Dan's law firm worked with local authorities to track her down. It turns out she was staying at some cheap motel off the strip with a guy she met gaming. Not the fancy resort she was posting pics from. She was just hanging around the nice hotels, taking selfies, pretending she was staying there. The cops showed up at her motel room on Tuesday morning. According to the report, she tried claiming she was just on vacation and that the kids were perfectly fine with their sister. The officers weren't impressed. They brought her back yesterday. Honestly, seeing her in handcuffs was strange. She didn't look like the confident sister who'd been flirting with my husband and demanding we raise her kids. She looked small, scared. The charges are pretty serious. Child abandonment, child neglect from before she left them with us, child endangerment, and some other legal stuff I don't fully understand. But Dan says it's bad. The DA's office interviewed Ben and Lisa last week. They did a thing called a forensic interview, where they talked to kids about abuse or neglect. Ben told them everything. How he's been taking care of Lisa since he was 6. How Jen would leave them alone for days. How sometimes they didn't have food because she spent the money on herself. Lisa started crying during her interview when they asked about meals. She said she was scared they'd have to go hungry again. I had to leave the room. My parents are freaking out. They keep trying to get Dan to make this go away. He flat out refused and told them that if they try to interfere with the legal process, they could lose custody of the kids too. Mom tried the whole "she's mentally ill" excuse. Yeah, no. Jen's not mentally ill. She's just selfish. She always has been. They're doing a psych evaluation anyway as part of the case, but Dan says it's standard procedure. The gaming guy from Vegas? Turns out he had no idea Jen even had kids. She told him she was a rich, single girl looking for adventure. He actually contacted Dan's office when he found out the truth and wanted to help with the case. He sent screenshots of all their conversations, where Jen bragged about having no responsibilities and being completely free. Jen's not talking to any of us now. Her court-appointed lawyer told her to stay quiet, but she did send me this long text last night. You happy now? You finally got everyone to notice you instead of me. Bet you planned this whole thing. You were always jealous that Mom and Dad loved me more. Well, congrats. Hope you're satisfied now that you've ruined my life. I didn't respond. What is there to say? She abandoned her kids on my doorstep in the middle of winter. She did this to herself. They even searched her motel room and found receipts for designer clothes and expensive restaurants. She had money. She just chose to spend it on herself instead of her kids. And yeah, it's been 6 months since everything went down with Jen. The court case finally wrapped up last week. Jen took a plea deal. She's getting 18 months in state prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 months, plus 5 years probation after release. She also lost all parental rights. The judge wasn't messing around. He said something about how the systematic neglect and final abandonment showed a complete disregard for her children's well-being. My parents actually got their act together, which honestly surprised everyone. I think, finally, seeing all the evidence in court and hearing what Ben and Lisa had been through, it changed something. Mom actually stood up in court and said Jen needed to face consequences. I never thought I'd see that happen. The kids are doing better, actually better, not just putting on a brave face. They're still living with my parents, but there's been a complete change in how things work. My parents had to take parenting classes as part of the custody agreement. Dan's idea. He's scary smart about this stuff. They've set up proper bedrooms for the kids, got them into good schools, and they're taking them to therapy every week. My parents tried reaching out after everything settled. Dad sent me a long email about how sorry he was about the college fund and how he sees things differently now. Mom keeps trying to call, saying she wants to start fresh. But you know what? Some things you can't just apologize away. 8 years of silence and they only show up when they need something? Nah, I'm done. Aunt Pat's been amazing throughout all of this. She visits the kids at my parents' house regularly and makes sure they're actually being taken care of properly. The kids adore her. They call her Grandma Pat, which honestly feels more right than my parents being grandparents. Jen's in prison, where she belongs. She sent me this dramatic letter full of excuses and self-pity, talking about how prison changed her, and how she sees everything differently now. Not one word asking about her kids. Classic Jen. It's still all about her. That letter went straight into the trash. Dan and I see the kids every other weekend, but not at my parents' house. We pick them up and take them out. Movies, parks, normal aunt and uncle stuff. Ben asked me last week if I was mad at my parents. I told him the truth. Grown-ups sometimes have complicated feelings about each other, but that doesn't change how much we love you and Lisa. People keep asking if I'll ever forgive my parents or Jen. Honestly, some things you can't come back from. Yeah, they're taking care of the kids now, but only because they were forced to. They haven't changed. They just ran out of options. So here we are. The kids are safe. They have stability, even if it's not the perfect situation. As for my parents, we keep it strictly about the kids. No personal conversations, no unnecessary drama. Sometimes, distance is the healthiest choice. And as for me, life moves forward. Oh, and I found out that I'm pregnant, and Dan is over the moon. Thanks for all the support through this crazy journey, Reddit. You guys helped more than you know. Yes, Ben and Lisa know they can call us anytime. We got them their own phones, kids' versions with parental controls specifically for this. To everyone asking, the cats still love having the kids over for weekends. Ben's actually helping me teach the new kitten tricks. This account is probably going dark after this post. Dan says it's better not to have too many details online once everything is finalized. Just know we're all doing okay.